In 1998, more than a year after Diana's death, I wrote a book that attempted to discover the truth about the relationship between the prince and princess. I called the book Charles, Victim or Villain, because first wanted to determine, if possible, which of the two he was. Had he caused Diana's problems, as she had suggested in her famous Panorama interview, by his obsession with Camilla Parker Bowles? Or had Diana gone into that marriage already damaged and Charles had returned to Camilla Parker Bowles because he couldn't cope with her erratic behavior? Had he, in short, been a villain, or was he as much a victim as Diana? The conclusion I came to, after talking to many of the key people in their lives during this period, was that there were no villains. While Charles sank into ever deeper depression, mystified by Diana's mood swings and his inability to make her happy, she embarked on a series of love affairs which were each as unfulfilling as the last. Charles, meanwhile, started seeing those friends that he had ostracized at Diana's insistence. Now back in the fold, they were deeply concerned about how their friend had changed in the intervening years, and feared he might be close to thoughts of self-destruction. He had said nothing about the difficulties of his relationship and had been loyal to Diana to the nth degree, but they guessed that if anyone could help restore his spirits it would be Camilla, whose own marriage was less than fun, and Patty Palmer Tompkinson put them in touch. Charles and Camilla had not seen each other to speak to since his engagement, except once, on the occasion when he gave her the famous bracelet, and the only telephone call was with the news that Diana was pregnant. At first they wrote each other long letters, then there were phone calls, and after several months they met at the house of their mutual friend, and eventually the relationship became physical. Camilla became his lifeline. She made his spirits soar, although it was a long climb back from the abyss. She was a sympathetic ear, someone who understood and cared about him, and crucially believed in him, and the only person to whom he felt he could speak openly and honestly without for a second doubting she would keep his trust. Yet there was a lightness in the friendship too, and an easiness. She was on the same wavelength. She had the same sense of humor, loved the same things and shared the same interests. Her marriage to Andrew was a sham. Although she was deeply fond of him, and remained so, he had been unfaithful to her for years. Whatever Diana might have imagined, and whatever she accused her husband of when she spoke to Andrew Morton, Charles did not commit adultery, as he said to Jonathan Dimbleby, until his marriage had broken down irretrievably, and he did not sleep with Camilla on the night before his wedding, as Diana claimed he did. He may have weaknesses in his character, but Charles has never been dishonorable. If anything, he has been too honest for his own good, unable to tell the white lie that would have harmed no one and prevented the emotional tsunami. He was racked with guilt about Camilla, little knowing about Diana's own infidelities, which had begun years earlier. Once Diana realized that Camilla was back in the picture, she went into meltdown, and any pretense of proper married life became impossible. They could barely tolerate being in the same room as each other, let alone under the same roof, as everyone who worked for them was painfully aware. The curse of royalty is that there is no privacy and no clear distinction between work and play, public and private. There were blistering rows, tears and hysterics, rage and fury, all heard to some degree by everyone who was hapless enough to be in the house. Kensington Palace was small and badly soundproofed, but not even the Cotswold stone walls at Highgrove were enough to keep the poison from pervading the house, and as time passed it was increasingly out in the open. Greeting one of his staff in full uniform one morning before setting off on a formal engagement, the prince said, "You only have one medal. We'll have to do something about that." Whereupon the princess, following Charles down the stairs, said, "Yes, but at least he earned his." Such moments were uncomfortable for everyone, but the sarcastic remarks weren't reserved for the prince. Members of the household often found themselves in the firing line too. As one of them said, "I would have given up all the flowers, all the niceness if only we could have avoided the sheer bloody-minded sarcasm, the silences, and sending to Coventry that went with it." It was a lottery what kind of mood both bosses would be in. The prince, always demanding but normally friendly, polite and businesslike, was prone to unnerving temper tantrums. They quickly passed, and although he didn't always apologize, he thought no more about it. The princess was deadlier. In a good mood, she was a veritable angel and couldn't do enough to help people, be they strangers, staff, family or friends. She would send their mothers flowers on their birthdays, give them presents and open her heart to them. That could turn on a sixpence, and if she got it into her head that someone was plotting against her, or being disloyal, or she simply no longer liked having them around, they found themselves out in the cold, cut dead. Members of staff lost their jobs, friends were cut adrift without a word, and even her own mother endured long periods of estrangement from Diana. Arguably, the only people Diana consistently loved were William and Harry. She would repeatedly say, "They mean everything to me." Her love for them was almost obsessive, and it was possessive. As if she was afraid that if she didn't demonstrate it, with treats and hugs, or verbalize it, they might not be aware of it. She couldn't leave them to be quietly confident of her love for them, as they were of their fathers. Another of her favorite phrases to the children was, "Who loves you most?" She told her biographer Andrew Morton, "I want to bring them up with security, not to anticipate things because they will be disappointed. That's made my own life so much easier. I hug my children to death and get into bed with them at night. I always feed them love and affection. It's so important." No one knew better than she how painful and upsetting it had been for her as a child to see her mother cry when her parents' marriage disintegrated, and to hear her brother call out for their absent mother in the night. She knew precisely how sad and insecure it made her feel. Yet now she was a mother, she seemed unconcerned that William and Harry should see her tears and witness her distress, in just the same way as she had witnessed her own mother's. William, being older, was more aware, and almost took on a parenting role. She spoke about running into her bathroom in tears one day, after an altercation with Charles over the Duke and Duchess of York's separation, and William pushing paper tissues under the closed door, saying, "I hate to see you sad." William was only 10. The reality was Diana was not always as warm and demonstrative in private as she was in public, and she wasn't the only one who handed out the laughter and the hugs. Away from the cameras, the boys saw the extremes of her moods as clearly as everyone else and were often quite frightened and bewildered by them. When a friend once suggested it was unwise to have hysterics in front of Prince William, who was then in a cot, Diana said he was too young to notice, and anyway, he would have to learn the truth sooner or later. Her attitude to their learning the truth was much the same when it came to her lovers. Several men had come and gone from her life after Harry's birth, but there was one, James Hewitt, whom she seems to have loved very deeply. During the 5 years of the affair, he was part of William and Harry's lives too. Hewitt was a charming, good-looking young officer in the Life Guards, one of the regiments that form the household cavalry, which traditionally guards the sovereign and the royal household. He was a brilliant horseman and, as it turned out, a first-class cad, but their affair lasted longer than any other. They first met in a corridor when she flirtatiously admired his uniform. They met again at a party in St. James's Palace in 1986 when she asked whether he would teach her to ride. Riding lessons at his Windsor barracks swiftly turned into a love affair, and he later revealed that she seduced him. As she confessed so publicly on Panorama, it was all true. "Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him. But I was very let down." During their affair he was a frequent visitor at Kensington Palace but also at Highgrove, when the prince was away. Diana would invite him for weekend parties and allot him a bedroom across the corridor from her own, where she slept in a 4-poster bed. Once everyone else was asleep, he would creep into her bed for the night, returning to his room before the rest of the house was awake. This ruse fooled no one, except perhaps William and Harry, who slept in the nursery above. Like their mother, they thought the world of Hewitt. He represented everything that small boys admire. He took them to his barracks and dressed them in little army uniforms he had specially made and let them climb all over the tanks and other armored vehicles at Windsor. He joined in pillow fights and read them their favorite bedtime stories. He gave them riding lessons on their ponies, and took them and Diana to stay with his mother at her home in Devon. He always insisted he hadn't tried to take the place of their father, but he evidently bonded with them and both boys seemed to enjoy their time with him. Maybe what they enjoyed, subliminally, was seeing their mother happy. When he went to the Gulf in 1991, after Britain's invasion of Iraq, Diana wrote him long, loving letters, which could so easily have fallen into the wrong hands. She watched the TV news avidly, with Harry beside her, fearful that he might be killed. When he returned home safe the following year and grew ever more besotted with her, she ended it in her usual way by refusing to take his calls. In what Diana saw as a devastating betrayal of trust, Hewitt wrote a book, Love and War, about their affair when it was over. He had been cut to the quick when she ended it, but recalled the happy times he'd spent with William and Harry and said they had appeared to have the time of their lives. Hewitt was a redhead like Harry, and a rumor persisted in the wake of the affair that Harry was Hewitt's son. It was untrue. He and Diana didn't meet until Harry was 2 years old, yet it persisted, and there are some who still ask the question today. Dates aside, Harry has the Spencer family coloring and his father's and grandfather's green eyes. He is a Windsor through and through, or, as Diana used to call him, my little Spencer. Their father turned a blind eye to what was going on. As he wrote in one letter, I don't want to spy on her or interfere in her life in any way. But she didn't have the monopoly on love towards their sons. He had been brought up to keep his emotions hidden from public display, but it didn't mean he didn't have those emotions or couldn't show them. Away from the cameras, he was every bit as loving as Diana, but in a different way. He would fool around with the boys, kick a football and have a rough and tumble. They share the same silly sense of humor and are great practical jokers, as Diana was too, also talented mimics. They loved going to polo matches with their father or to follow the hunt. They also loved watching him shoot, and were not yet in their teens when they first picked up a gun themselves, taught by the gilly at Balmoral, Willie Potts, from whom they also learnt to cast for salmon. Charles built them a massive treehouse in a holly tree at Highgrove, wittily known as Holyrood House, after the Palace of Holyrood House, the Queen's official residence in Edinburgh. But as well as the boys' own stuff, they weren't afraid to hug and kiss, even in their teens. Charles never invited Camilla to the house when the boys were there, but William, at least, as the elder and Diana's confidant, will have known about her existence. Her name was never far from Diana's lips. She called her, the Rottweiler, and it was frequently accompanied by vitriol or by tears. It was a lot for a child to handle. Even if his parents had tried to remain civil in front of him and his brother, it would have been impossible for two such sensitive children not to have sensed the tension and noticed the absences. Even the press noticed those. At the end of the summer of 1987, one newspaper calculated that Charles and Diana had spent one day together in 6 weeks. They had long stopped sleeping in the same room. They saw their own friends, did their own things and lived largely separate lives. The only times they came together and affected a show of unity were at family gatherings that Diana couldn't get out of, joint engagements and the children's school events, most memorably the Wetherby Sports Days where, for a couple of years running, Diana triumphed in the mother's race. Having kicked off her high heels and run like a gazelle, she made Charles look churlish and stuffy as she badgered him to run with the fathers, only to demonstrate what he knew at the outset, that running was not his forte. Yet during these years in the mid to late 1980s, when their private lives were so disastrous, they were in many ways a formidable double act. The prince had established himself as a controversial figure, and although some people were bemused by his stance on various issues from architecture to complementary medicine, many of his speeches had struck a chord with the public, as the hundreds of letters that arrived in his office made clear. The prince's trust had begun to see impressive results in helping young people make a start in life. He was busily importing ideas from America to help solve inner-city problems through his involvement with business in the community, and he was making big waves on the environmental front. Diana, meanwhile, looking ever more glamorous and delighting the fashion industry, was making it clear that she had more to offer than her looks. She had taken on unglamorous causes like drug abuse, marriage guidance and AIDS, and was proving to be quite unparalleled in her ability to charm, communicate and empathize with ordinary people. Abroad, they were a sensation on every trip. In Australia, America, the Gulf states, Italy, Japan, the reception was rapturous. At home, the combination was never more successful than as joint patrons of the Wishing Well Appeal for Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. The target was £30 million in 2 years, and in well under that time, they had helped raise £54 million with a further £30 million promised by the government. No one saw what went on behind closed doors, and those that did, who knew that both Charles and Diana were seeing other people, never thought for a moment that this might imperil the marriage. Okay, it wasn't happy, but it wasn't the first aristocratic marriage to find a way of accommodating differences. At that time, Charles had an office in St. James's Palace, but he had no press office of his own and relied on the team at Buckingham Palace. Their concern was how to manage the runaway success of the royal couple. They felt the need to pace it, not to allow too much exposure, not to allow them to give too many interviews, not to let too much light in on the mystery of monarchy. They were well aware that members of the royal family were not like normal celebrities, whose popularity would wax and wane. They had to keep the popularity going for a very long time, maybe 20 or 30 years. Unlike politics or show business or any other career in which fame and popularity are a measure of success, the monarchy is a long-term game. There is no stepping out of public life when the going gets tough, no retreating into anonymity or even retiring at 60. The work goes on remorselessly and the exposure with it, and as every celebrity knows, the greater the adulation, the faster it can disappear. The danger was if they had too much too quickly they wouldn't be able to sustain it. It is the dilemma that William's team grapples with today.